And we can admit everyone into the waiting room now, from the waiting room now. Okay, over to you, Tawanda. We'll just give it a few seconds for people to join.
Okay. Okay, should I just let me know when
Yeah, you can start now, thanks.
all right, all right. Good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you today. My name is Dr. Tawanda Sachikonye, and I'm a research consultant for SALO. I focus primarily on the G20 program. Today we've got a very interesting and pertinent topic, and it's entitled Fostering African Voices on the G20 Compact with Africa, point 2.0. Therefore, we're highlighting the importance of infusing the compact with Africa, firstly with African voices, ideas, recommendations, as well as secondly, a more developmental focus informed by African challenges. So the Compact of Africa was initiated by Germany during its 2017 presidency, and is essentially complemented Germany's Africa-focused Marshall Plan for Africa foreign policy approach. So the key focus of the compact with Africa is to boost private investment to and within Africa in relation to two key aspects. The first is foreign direct investment, and the second is the enhancement of domestic capital markets, but also it tends to also then have a focus on infrastructure development. Right. The compact focuses on capacity building and technical assistance in terms of initiating economic reforms which seek to stimulate greater private investment in Africa. Right. But I think my colleague Safura Sadek will provide a broader overview and a more detailed overview than I've done. And I'd like to then welcome her, and she can give us some very insightful opening remarks. Please, Safura, I would hand over to you.
Thank you, Tawanda. For that, I am going to do a brief introduction. Lily, is it, oh, Busi, I think. I've done it as a slide presentation. So if it's possible for you to put it on the screen. Okay, that's in the middle of the presentation, so we need to go back to the beginning. Okay. So I'm just doing the introductory remarks, and Dr. Tawanda has covered some of the issues. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so here it's just giving a bit of a background about the Compact with Africa. As Dr. Tawanda had said, it was launched in 2017, and that was under the German presidency of the G20 for that year. So the Compact with Africa, or CWA, as its acronym is used, is actually a central pillar of a broader partnership with Africa that was signed at that time. This pillar of the CWA operates within the finance track of the G20, which ties in with what Dr. Tawanda was saying about it focusing on issues of investment, etc. So the idea and the way the C20 operates, there's kind of a whole lot of structures. What they did do at the beginning is set up a technical team. They brought in some other experts. So the technical team was made up of the three international organizations, namely the African Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank. Okay. So they worked together, they brought in other experts, and then they came up with a kind of set of criteria, which I'll speak to just now. So whatever programs or compacts are signed with African countries under the CWA, it's supposed to be and should be coherent and complementary to other initiatives. But the focus, as you can see, is on advancing private investment to increase employment and foster sustainable growth. And this dialogue is to actually look at whether the CWA in its current form is doing that. Is that what the current domestic, continental, and geopolitical and economic situation in the world still requires, okay? I think for me personally, when you look at the three IOs involved, of course, the only African organization involved is the African Development Bank, and that the IMF and the World Bank Group are still prominent role players again, as we find generally when we talk about African agenda in international institutions and in international work. Sort of the domination of the Western voices, okay? So at the end of the criteria if you want to become or sign a compact under the CWA, the African governments have to do a country level assessment, okay? Then it's done with potential partner countries, the IOs, and any other institutes with relevant experience. Next slide, please. Okay, now if you look at the set of issues, and this is just going through researching and trying to pull out the key issues and issues that we need to look at and discuss today, and we'll be hearing from our speakers today, is that the CWA is about finances and economic, right? Financial issues, economic issues, but when you look at the priorities, it's also again about questioning the extent to which these priorities support or distort a Western global dominance in that space, even though the African Development Bank is one of the organizations. So they've got three categories against which they make an assessment. The one is the macroeconomic environment. The second is the business environment in which firms operate. And the third is the finance environment facing would-be investors. Now, the idea around these three priorities and the expectation is that the African country will re-look at, or African countries will re-look at their policies around macroeconomic environment, their macroeconomic financial policies, business environment, investment policies, etc., to be able to meet these criteria. Okay. So the policy change happens within the domestic laws of the country in terms of the SWA. And as I said again, it's something we need to examine and look at, and that's the Western global dominance, finding the voice of Africa, pushing African agency, recognizing Africa as a key economic global power. So that for me is one of the areas I think one needs to look at, is the categories and how they were developed. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of how it works, there's a structure called an Africa Advisory Group. Okay, it's established as a regular G20 working group. And this AAG is responsible for implementation of the reports that come from the CWA. Okay, the CWA reports go to the G20 finance ministers and the central bank governors, and they are reporting on progress, future ambitions, measurable targets in each compact country. Its membership is demand-driven. So it's open to all African countries, but you decide whether you want to be part of the CWA. And so you make the decision, they call it self-select to participate, okay? When you make the decision to participate, you have to sign and commit to an investment compact. And in that investment compact is a commitment to engage with the three IOs involved. So the three IOs then discuss whatever initiative you're putting forward and possible national priorities and contributions. So again, I think if you look at this part of how the CWA operates, has an advisory group, a regular G20 working group, access to the finance ministers, etc. And and basically again you're seeing that it's the IOs which IMF, World Bank, with a bit of input from the African Development Bank. At the moment, there's only 13 countries that have chosen to sign investment compacts, CWA investment compacts. It's from Northeast and West Africa, so the Southern African region isn't involved. I've listed the countries here that have signed compacts. And so I think my next slide, I just want to see what it is. Okay, I'm not going into this part now because I don't want to obviously kind of preempt, or we've got speakers who are going to speak to this. But just to say that in December, on the 12th of December 2024, SALO had a dialogue that also focused on the CWA. It was a dialogue specifically on the CWA. There were key takeaways and recommendations made in that SALO dialogue for consideration, and issues that need to be addressed as we reimagine the CWA. What did you call it, Dr. Tawanda? CWA 2.0.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm gonna stop at this point. And if necessary, when we go into yeah, go into discussion, I can then speak to some of these slides again. So Dr. Tawanda, back to you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Safura, for that insightful overview of the compact with Africa, and also setting the tone for the dialogue today. So as we undertake this dialogue, it's very important to assess two key aspects. The first is the compact with Africa a necessary intervention? And secondly, does it have African buy-in? Okay, so then I've got some notes here, but I think let's go to the speakers. Then I can always come back to this. So those two questions are very important. I'll just repeat them again. Is the Compact with Africa a necessary intervention? And secondly, does it have African buy-in? Okay, so our first speaker will be Laura Rubich, who is the foreign policy researcher and project coordinator at the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIA. Laura holds a master's in international relations, cum laude, from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, or University of Wits. She's also engaged with the coordination of the Think 20 Africa Network. Her research interests include global economic governance, African foreign policy, development financing, and strengthening Africa's role in multilateralism, including the G20. Therefore, we're very, very lucky to have her today to speak on this forum. I would also highly recommend Laura's recent, insightful, as well as well-written paper entitled Leveraging the South Africa G20 Presidency to Scale Up the Compact with Africa. I happy to admit that I read this paper as I was preparing to chair this dialogue, and I found it very, very informative and insightful. Many thanks, many thanks, Laura. Please welcome to the forum.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Wanda and Sephora for really laying the groundwork for this discussion, which means that I don't need to go into the background of it. I can jump straight in and focus on two really interrelated issues, and that's being the priorities of the South African presidency on the Compact with Africa, and secondly, how the Compact with Africa can be strengthened. And as I said, these two issues are directly related. When referring to the Compact with Africa in its preparations for its presidency, and since it has taken over its presidency, South Africa has noted that it is wanting to champion an elevated and broadened Compact with Africa. And this aspiration really fits within the broader focus of the South African G20 presidency to strengthen African voices of the G20 and for it to have an African G20 presidency, as it is called. In terms of the actual engagement with the Compact under its presidency, South Africa will be hosting a special Compact with Africa meeting in Addis Ababa in July. It will focus on coordinating the work of African countries, G20 partner countries, and international organizations. And this has been a common thread throughout the South African G20 presidency so far. The meeting provides an opportunity to strengthen African voices in the Compact with Africa as a G20 initiative. The AU has been a strong supporter of the initiative and has been quite actively engaged in the AAG meetings since it's formally become a G20 member state, which has been a very welcome step forward. So now moving on to what we can do to strengthen the Compact. I want to highlight 4 key ways that I see this happening under the South African presidency this year, but also going beyond that. And the first way I see this happening is if South Africa can aim for more engagement and more members. As very low-hanging fruit, South Africa could facilitate the process of admitting more members. As Sephora mentioned, we currently have 13 members in the Compact, but there are other African member states that are very interested in joining. Zambia, for example, submitted and presented their application to the AAG in December 2024. Angola, Kenya, and Namibia have also applied, but they've not yet submitted their reform matrices. So by the end of the South African presidency, it's really feasible to see that the Compact could have more members. Another way to improve engagement under the South African presidency, which may not be as easy, would be to increase engagement of other G20 countries and also with the private sector. One of the strongest criticisms of the Compact since 2017 has been the lack of engagement or active engagement of other G20 countries and the private sector itself. On the latter, during the development of the reform matrices, the African participating countries receive technical assistance from international organizations, but it's very rare that the private sector is engaged at this point. And going back to the core mandate of the Compact, which is promoting private investment in Africa, direct engagement with the private sector on what reforms are necessary to elicit their investment, it's really important. And to go beyond this, I think direct engagement could build trust, it could build partnership between private sector and participating African governments, and this could lead to possibly more risk-taking in the investors themselves. And secondly, I think that expanding the understanding of private investment is very important. It has almost by default been an assumption that private sector investment under the Compact, that the Compact is targeting, is from other G20 countries, and this is beyond the continent. South Africa's own DIRCO minister remarked at the African Union Executive Council in February this year that the Compact aims at attracting investment from pools of private sector funds in the global north. But what about intra-African investment? The continent holds about 2.3 trillion US dollars of wealth. Why are we not targeting this? And I think thirdly, we can look at turning reform into reward. And this is possible through spotlighting some key areas of investment. The underlying logic of the Compact is that the macroeconomic reforms, through macroeconomic reforms, African member states can create attractive environments for private investment, which will lead to economic growth. But there are a few chinks in the chain that I think are missing here. and that is that private investment is a necessary condition for improving economic growth trajectories in African member states, but it is not necessarily sufficient. Africa's low income levels extend beyond the realm of investment. It includes other dimensions of economic development, such as the role of a functioning state, mobilization of both public and private domestic resources. And it's not simply a lack of available capital. So I think there needs to be a direct link between creating an enabling investment environment and also attracting investment that is directly linked to the long-term development strategies of these participating countries. And that's at a national and regional level. The South African government has noted that in its engagement with the Compact in Africa this year, it will be driven by Agenda 2063 and particularly the second 10-year implementation. And I think this is a step in the right direction. But I think we can go a little bit further, and it might be useful to even select certain sectors and create very specific metrics to measure the success. And this could, for example, be using SMART goals, which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. As an example, under the second 10-year implementation plan, one of the commitments is to provide tax incentives and a conducive regulatory environment to encourage private sector investment in science, technology, and innovation. And this is towards a target of having the digital sector contributing to 7% of the GDP. Could this form a SMART goal for the Compact plan? Another way would be to use country platforms. We've seen some Compact with Africa countries using this quite successfully, and this could ensure that investments are channeled towards priority development areas and that they also complement public sector investments to ensure that there's complementarity and effectiveness. And I think finally, and this is really looking more at the longer term, how can we reshape the Compact to be more impactful, more effective? And this is where I think we need to think outside the box a bit. As I noted previously, one of the key issues with the Compact or challenges has been the lack of engagement with other G20 countries. Would, for example, adding a third co-chair to the Compact, which is held by the rotating G20 presidency, could this increase buy-in and participation from other G20 countries? Now, I think it's worth noting that this may not be a politically viable option now, especially under the current US administration that South Africa is handing over to in November, which is probably more likely to scale down G20 commitments and responsibilities of the hosting presidency rather than increase the responsibility of the hosting presidency for G20 initiatives. Another issue could be that under Compact with Africa 2.0, there is a large funding gap. At least $100 million US of additional funds are required to implement the Compact with Africa 2.0 program. Under the 2024 Compact with Africa monitoring report, it noted that the South African presidency provides a unique opportunity to mobilize contributions from G20 countries through the international organization's multi-donor trust fund. And this is to support the implementation of the Compact with Africa. But is there another way that this initiative could be funded? Under the second 10-year implementation plan, there is a commitment to explore the possibility of establishing a development fund, which would be a basket fund to which resources are mobilized. Could this be a way to mobilize and distribute funding for the Compact with Africa that is more directly linked to the continent and also inputted by the continent? So neither of these last two ideas, I think, are likely to come to fruition under South Africa's G20 presidency, but I think that they could be explored under South Africa's G20 at 20 review that it's conducting under its presidency this year. And these issues and the possible reshaping of the Compact could also be explored by the G20 Africa Expert Panel, which has been appointed by the South African Finance Minister, and the Compact is under its mandate for review. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much for that very informative and perceptive presentation. I think it's also important to note that South Africa is a co-chair of the Compact with Africa. That's very important. And this has been, I think, since 2017. So South Africa has been a very key member of the Compact with Africa. And then you noted how it's very important for there to be, there's a need for more African private sector engagement. But I just wanted to also pose a question to you that you can answer maybe a bit later during the dialogue question and answer session. If 83% of Africans operate in the informal sector, does that then mean that the informal sector, in terms of the small and medium enterprises, are recognized tangibly as the African private sector? Well, which private sector are we talking about when we always refer to the African private sector? Because the majority of Africans are employed in the small and medium enterprise sector, but also within the broader informal sector. Then you also mentioned, of course, the need to improve the monitoring of Compact with Africa reforms, and you posed the possibility of a third co-chair, to help with that oversight. And then I think the notion of a development fund is very, very intriguing. That has got greater input from G20 members. So that's quite interesting. The notion of a development fund. Okay, thank you so much, Laura. I'd like now to move on to our next speaker, who's Dr. Nomvula Bongiwe Ngobo Palele. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Bongiwe has a PhD in international relations from the University of Pretoria. Her research interests include South African foreign policy and diplomacy, the analysis of multilateral forums such as BRICS, the G20, the SADC, and the African Union. She also focuses on women in peace and security, as well as women's empowerment, women's financial inclusion, climate, and the just energy transition. Previously, before joining the Thabo Mbeki School, she was a researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, which is located at the University of Johannesburg. In addition, she has taught mediation, diplomacy, and public policy at the University of Pretoria. For her postdoctoral research, she aims to advance her knowledge around how South Africa navigates the current geopolitical landscape, including its involvement in the G20. So once again, we're very lucky to have her join us today. But I also highly recommend Dr. Bongiwe's co-authored article with Dr. Darlington Chuma entitled South Africa's G20 Presidency, Tapping into Africa's Potential Through Financial, Climate, and Food System Reform. That's a very insightful paper on South Africa G20 presidency. Dr. Bobo Palele, please, I'd like to welcome you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Tafazwe. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. If you could just raise the camera a little bit, so we can.
Is it
Yes,
fine now?
thank you. Perfect, thank you. Okay, welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Morning, everyone. My name is Bongiwe Mpahlele, as introduced by Tafazwe. So I'm not going to give the background as it has already been given, but I think it's important to note that South Africa has taken the presidency of the G20 under different circumstances with everything that is going on globally. The current trade tensions, which continues to disrupt global markets, and there are challenges with multilateralism, which is increasingly as well. And then, so this carries implications for Africa, affect the dynamics of, and so what we have seen recently, the reduced aid flows, the continued climate shocks, and the mounting debt levels, which are constraining Africa's ability to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and the AU's Agenda 2063. So against this background, that South Africa is a G20 president becomes timely and strategic at the same time, with its theme solidarity, equality, and sustainability. South Africa must ensure that Africa's voice is not only heard, but also acted upon. And one of the most critical instruments, which has already been highlighted, is the G20 Compact with Africa, where South Africa can actually prioritize this while they're holding the presidency seat. So as the co-chair, together with Germany, South Africa has a strategic role to shape a renewed Compact with Africa 2.0, the one that reflects the continent's economic development aspirations and structural transformation agenda. So according to the monitoring report of the Compact with Africa, many of the 13 countries which are a part of the Compact with Africa have made notable progress on the reform implementation, particularly on improving tax systems and digital infrastructure and energy government. However, we have to ask a question if these reforms are really driving the kinds of inclusive African-centered development outcomes they want to see, which is what South Africa is trying to promote at the G20 at the moment. So it is my view that the implementation of the reforms should not only focus on the investor environment, but they should also be expanded to focus on issues that affect growth in Africa, such as job creation and intra-African trade. And secondly, they must not be a benchmark externally, but it should be developed internally within the African continent using the AU agencies, such as the AU Development Agency, which will ensure that there is enough ownership. And then lastly, the monitoring process, which has largely excluded African civil society and regional institutions and grassroots and research bodies, should be more inclusive of these groups in Africa, so that it ensures that it addresses the issues that affect the nations, the African nations, and the ordinary African people who are affected by economic development changes. So if we imagine what the Compact Africa 2.0 should look like, in my view, it should be central to African economic priorities. So these reforms should be aligned with Agenda 2063 and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and also the country-led development plans, which focuses on sustainable development and trade issues that are necessary for growth in Africa. It should also build African agency within this monitoring. It should be led by African governments and regional bodies, as I have already indicated. And then it should also acknowledge that the ownership by Africans and African government and African countries should be strengthened and better reflect country-specific development. With regards to South Africa and how South Africa can use the opportunity at the G20 while they are presiding over the G20, as the G20 president and co-chair of the Compact with Africa, South Africa should champion a review of the first phase of Compact at the G20 summit. So South Africa is currently reviewing the G20 systems and processes under what they call the G20 at 20 review. So I believe that as South Africa is conducting this review, it should also look at the Compact with Africa and use this opportunity to filter in or put forward the recommendations. One of those recommendations should be to boost the advisory African group by advocating for additional members of African countries to join in, because it's important to have more voices of African countries within this compact under the G20. The more we have these African voices, the more we have more African countries within the compact with Africa, is the more that African development issues will be reflected. And then they will be able to build and campaign for an investment that reflects the true needs of the African continent, rather than the ones that are brought externally by the external investors. And then another recommendation also is to prioritize an investment area like the digital public infrastructure. One of the areas that South Africa can prioritize as an area of investment throughout Africa. I think digital transformation is a true need for all African, for the whole continent. So this is one area that South Africa can really campaign for investment under the Compact with Africa. Digitalization can actually have an impact in economic development. And this is something that the whole continent is in need of. And then with regards to specific outcomes that South Africa should push for during its G20 presidency, South Africa should advocate for integration of African development frameworks, which I've already indicated slightly on earlier, but one of them is Agenda, excuse, Agenda 2063. And then it should also emphasize institutionalized co-leadership. This should, monitoring processes should be led by.
Oh, so you're breaking there, sorry. Oh. Hello? I think did we lose Dr. Bongiwe?
Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
okay. I think you just broke there for a second. Continue. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry, it was my network.
Sure. Okay. Please continue.
Okay, so I'm going to make my last point. So I was saying that while South Africa is presiding over the G20, I think it's important for them to push, to focus on key things that can be delivered while they are still within the presidency. One of them was to promote institutionalized co-leadership in the monitoring report process. And that is to make sure that AU development agencies part of this, that is running the monitoring processes of the Compact with Africa, to ensure that, you know, all these the governance issues within the continent are covered, and the economic development issues are well presented. And then also ensure that civil society and private sector is also involved. Also ensure that regional economic committees are also part of this and are also involved in implementation, engaging with the nations which are part of the CWA. And then lastly, I think South Africa, as well as the CWA countries, should also think about what will happen beyond South Africa's presidency. I think Laura has already mentioned that the US is taking over next year. So the issue of whether what South Africa is promoting right now, and also within the context of CWA, whether the UA will be able to carry that over and still be able to support also financially. So South Africa should think about that, and together with these countries. So it's important that they start engaging the US and other potential partners who are able to support the CWA, so that to ensure that it does not die off after South Africa hands over to the USA. I think I'm gonna stop there right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bongiwe, for that very perceptive presentation. And you posed a very important query, which is that can South Africa's co-chair and also G20 president, co-chair of the Compact with Africa, and then also as G20 president, support an African-focused structural transformation agenda with a focus on job creation and an increase in inter-African trade? That's a very, very important query that you posed. And I think you're leading us in a good direction for a very robust discussion around that. But then you also mentioned, of course, the importance of the issue of ownership of the Compact with Africa by African countries. In my humble opinion, the Compact with Africa seems to have a structural adjustment element in terms of the reforms that it puts forward. So it's very important for African states to then have a lot of ownership over the process. You know what I mean? So, and it's good that the Compact Africa is voluntary. So that's very important, the degree of ownership that African countries can have over the process. And also recently, Rufus Dakote, an African Development Bank executive director, in a recent speech, called for what is termed a new development compact. And interestingly enough, some of the reforms that he called for actually align with what the Compact of Africa is trying to do, especially around domestic revenue and resource mobilization, which is something the Compact of Africa is trying to ensure that African countries improve upon, and also the importance of financial support to local entrepreneurs, primarily within the small and medium enterprise sector, as a key part of private sector development. So there seems to be some convergence between African thinking around the reforms needed for structural economic transformation, and the reforms that are put forward through the Compact with Africa. And then Dr. Bongiwe, you also mentioned the importance of digital transformation. And I'm a bit worried about this one because, 65% of Africa's population is below the age of 25, right? And yet we've only got apparently about 43% of Africans have access to the internet on a consistent basis. So we don't have the digital infrastructure in place to support digital transformation. So it's very important that the Compact with Africa has recognized infrastructure as a key challenge. So then we have to really invest in our infrastructure in order to then take advantage of our youth and the possibilities offered by the digital age and the internet. Thank you very much, Dr. Bongiwe. Right, so I don't think Dr. Raj Shinatram has joined us yet, right? Okay, so we'd like then to have Lily. I don't think Dr. Raj has joined us, right?
No, he hasn't.
Okay. Oh, he hasn't. All right. Okay. No problem. Okay. Then we'll move on, and I'd like to bring our next speaker forward. And this is Sanusha Naidu, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD. Sanusha Naidu is a foreign policy analyst, probably South Africa's most perceptive and dynamic foreign policy observer. Research interests include Africa's relations with emerging powers from the global south, including BRICS and IPSA, South Africa's foreign policy analysis, including South Africa's G20 presidency, and the role of track 2 diplomacy in international relations. Sanusha has a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire from the United Kingdom. She's previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town, and as well as managed the South African Foreign Policy Initiative, SAFPI, at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. She has an extensive publications record, which includes 2 edited volumes on Africa-China relations. Firstly, Chinese and African Perspectives on China and Africa by Pambazuka Press, published in 2010. And secondly, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Africa and China, published by the University of KwaZulu-Natal and co-edited Kweku Ampia. I think she's quite a household name on South African television, and I'm sure most of you have seen her on many news channels, including Al Jazeera, and South African media as well. Please welcome Sanusha. And I'm happy to say she's a good mentor of mine. She's been very, very good over the years in terms of encouraging me. Welcome, Sanusha.
Good morning, Tawanda. Thank you very much for those very kind words. All of it is not true, but I think it's important that we understand the context in which we are here today. And I want to thank SALO as well for providing the platform. I think it's important to keep having a continuous interaction and dialogue and engagement on the various dynamics and dimensions of the G20. So with me not getting too much into opening remarks, I think I have about 10, 15 minutes, Chair, to go forward. So I think for me, the compact it's fascinating, for one, that this compact has been in existence. It has been in terms of an articulation. It has been around from 2017. And what's really important, I think, for us to understand is to contextualize the compact in the context of where we are at the global level in terms of the global international system, the architecture, the structural conditions, and how Africa is featuring in that global architecture. And 2, what does this mean for the compact? One of the things that struck me about the compact, and perhaps I'm going to be a bit more facetious in terms of how I look at the compact, is what's its purpose? I think we keep thinking about the compact in the context of how it aligns to bringing on the kind of engagements with regard to the investment architecture, the investment ecosystem in Africa, the role of actors that are within it. But of course, the point made earlier by Sephora about the compact being about whether you want to join it or not. So there's a self kind of approach there. There's a voluntary approach to the compact. The second thing around this is that the compact, when it was formed or when it was articulated and in its inception in 2017, it was a world that was really pre-COVID, a world where there was a lot of interesting dynamics around development, the development architecture, the financing for development, and more importantly, I think the whole architecture around what does development mean in a pre-COVID world. We now sit in a world where a lot of things have been thrown out of kilter. There's no more business as usual. It's no more the same kind of dynamics. I think we're entering a very dystopian international system or a Gramscian international order. And that means that whatever is coming down the line, we're not sure what it is. And so how do we fit this compact in this architecture that is really creating a set of variables that are unknown, but an international system that is unpredictable, uncertain, and quite frightening for us because we don't know how all of this is going to kind of evolve in the next 15 to 20 years. And so the members of the compact are also have to think about this in the context of where is Africa going to be in these kinds of benchmarks that we're talking about. And so South Africa actually puts the compact on the agenda, quite rightly so, as all the other speakers have alluded to. But I think the challenge is, what is the value proposition of this compact going forward? And I'm not sure if it's Agenda 2063, because I think that it may have better traction around how does it align to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because there are investment protocols there. There's the protocol on trade in services, goods, and so forth. There's the protocol on investment protocols on the DSU unit, etc. And there's a protocol on women and children, and there's the protocol on digital transformation. Now, depending what your agenda setting looks like, and you are forecasting for the next short, medium, and long-term impact of the compact with regard to where you want to be, I think there needs to be not just only a review of where the compact is, where it was, where it is, and where it's going, but rather to forecast what is it that the compact is going to be doing in terms of the investment. The recommendations made by colleagues before me are very important because I think it gives us a roadmap to understand that alignment between the investment architecture that we're talking about, the issue about domestic mobilization of resources, and more importantly, what does financing for development mean in an African context? The question, I think, is really this kind of open-ended question where we're not sure whether Agenda 2063 is going to be in its current iteration as we go forward. Up until now, the assessment, the review, and the implementation protocols under Agenda 2063 have been very limited. The challenge we have is that we're trying to forecast a future for the youth in this continent where we're not even sure what the future looks like. So there's a whole lot of moving parts around the compact that needs to be taken into consideration. The question of if we have a demographic profile that is basically a positive impact for us in terms of where we want to be and the labor market and so forth, there's a counter argument to that. And that counter argument to that is, are structural conditions at the domestic level in Africa creating jobs for people? They're not. They're not creating the jobs for youth. In fact, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, if not a month, there was this whole piece in The Economist, which says that Africa is going to have the largest employable labor market, or a largest labor market, but that labor market is not going to be sitting in Africa. It's going to be moving to other parts. So there's these dynamics of structural conditions that the compact needs to look at. The other issue is what we are making the South African presidency of the G20 as a hinge, a hook. I think we've got to be careful. The G20 is not about binding agreements. The G20 is about how do you achieve the kind of collective engagement. And this is another point that Carlos Lopez makes very nicely in a Daily Maverick piece, where he talks about the way consensus is evolving in terms of the global governance architecture, and that we kind of entering this phase of consensus that is not binding, or the consensus that perhaps hasn't been binding. And so what we have invariably is a very kind of artificial consensus. The challenge you're going to have with the G20 going forward is what is going to be the iteration of the G20. And so the point about ownership of the CWA in the African context is also understanding that that ownership cannot be articulated based on whether you create a third chair of the CWA, whether you align it to the developing working group, etc., in terms of the reforms. It has to be an ownership that is from within, because you have to think about the G20 as evolving in response to the global economic conditions. And if that is the point of departure, then the CWA has to be much more than just whether you have people joining or countries joining, or whether you have a kind of, approach to it in terms of what is the consensus. Can there be consensus around particular issues that give the CWA traction going forward? The last 2 points I want to make, Chair, if I have time, is this issue that South Africa can be that kind of convening power in terms of the CWA, in terms of the kind of things that they put forward. I think in terms of the architecture and the priorities of the South African chairing of the G20, it's quite interesting. It's about 3 high-level task force, which is about inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality. It's about food security. It's about artificial intelligence, data governance, and innovation for sustainable development. Now, the one thing that I found very interesting is that the establishment of the Cost of Capital Commission, which I think intrinsically links back to the cost of investment in Africa, which is linked to the CWA, has now moved to a review. And that's because it becomes very expensive in terms of how much Africa can be able to, find capital at affordable rates in the global market. This inter-Africa kind of domestic resource mobilization has to be looked at in the context of, is it investment for development, or is it investment for trade that builds up inter-African trade, and then, of course, leads to the kind of outcomes you want in terms of the compact? I think these are the moving parts of this compact, because the compact in itself, if you're going to elevate it to a 2.0, whatever that means, I think it has to be much more than just about sitting in Addis Ababa and having a meeting. I think it has to be much more than what does this mean in terms of bringing in the private sector? What does it mean when you think about who is actually the beneficiaries of this compact? And I'm not seeing that right now. So I think we've got to be careful in terms of where this convening power is, because after South Africa, after the 30th of November 2025, when South Africa hands over to the US, whoever is going to be taking on the presidency in terms of accepting it on the US behalf, I think it's going to be a very different architecture that we have to think about. And the question would be, for me, is what is going to be the kind of sustainability, the kind of traction that's going to continue in terms of the compact that has to also work outside of the operating lines of the G20. So it cannot be that the G20 is the kind of overarching architecture for the CWA, but the question would be the other way around, is what is the overarching architecture of the CWA in the context of going forward? My last point, Chair, and I think this is something that we have to be also very careful of in making assumptions of what can be done, what should be done, and what is doable, is this question around the idea that we need to think about the CWA only in the context of the private sector, or in the context of intergovernmental institutions and state to state. I think that the challenge for us is that there's a sector in Africa which is really doing a lot of trade, and they're doing cross-border trade, whether they're in the formal sector, whether they're in the informal sector. And the question is, again, we have to be careful in making the assumption that the review of the CWA is going to be state-led. It has to be much more than state, because the state is really a critical actor, but it's not the only actor. So we may be entering a very interesting stage of the African context, the African continent, linked to what is happening globally, and that is we now have to start thinking of our of the CWA as aligned to other institutional frameworks, not just the Agenda 2063. I know I'm being very flippant about it, but I think we need to ask ourselves also, in terms of Agenda 2063, how many of us are going to be around till then? And I think that's going to be important, because a lot of our governments are changing. And that's going to be something that we need to have foresight on, that we're not going to be there at that point when the implementation, the Agenda 2063 is going to be it's a live document, but it's also not a live document in many ways. I think Agenda 2063 has to be looked at as aspirational, but the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is critical to the CWA, in my opinion, because if you can domesticate that in your rules of origin, in your kind of trade regime at the domestic level, and have some kind of alignment to that in the context of the CWA, I think it makes better sense to then have the traction around formulating policy. And I think the challenge for us in terms of the CWA is also the question of what the panel, the African expert panel led by former Minister Trevor Manuel is talking about. They're talking about something very critical in the panel, and that is around debt sustainability. So if we're talking investment, if we want to find hooks, if we want to find the traction around the CWA, the question would actually also be is how do you deal with the debt question and the cost of capital around debt? Because I think the coming crisis in the global economy is going to be around the question of debt ceilings and recession and other stuff. And if Africa has to have a CWA, and if that review has to come up, it has to be anchored in much more realistic outcomes than, of course, trying to think about it in terms of where we're going to be in 2063, but to try and forecast what is going to happen in the continent in the next 5 years, and think about the G20 as evolving and not staying the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanusha, for that insightful presentation. And you highlighted a key point about how structural conditions on the ground in most African countries are not creating jobs, especially the secure jobs that we tend to have in the formal sector. So we've got a very challenging problem of unsustainable unemployment. And you argue that the Compact Africa needs to directly address this issue. But I think this is also compounded by two key facts. And the first is that relates to infrastructure. And about infrastructure, we're talking about the economic infrastructure related to industrialization, manufacturing, roads, but also social infrastructure, talking about investments in human capital, things like healthcare, education, digital infrastructure. And it's estimated that Africa's infrastructure finance gap or deficit is estimated at 68 to 108 billion per annum per year. Even though Africa spends 130 to 170 billion per year on infrastructure, we still have about 100 billion of a deficit. And then the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa argues then in such a context, Africa's infrastructure deficit firstly reduces economic growth by 2% annually, and also cuts productivity by up to 40% annually. So I'm just mentioning that on top of the unsustainable unemployment that you rightly pointed out, Sanusha, the infrastructure finance gap is compounding that situation. But also we have a problem with trade finance support. And when we talk about trade finance support, we're referring here to the financial support provided to African enterprises for trade initiatives. And it's estimated that Africa has a trade finance support deficit gap of 81 billion per year, right? So on top of these billions of dollars of deficits, we also have debt repayments. So I'm worried, where is the money going to come from to finance our developmental agenda? So this is very, very, very worrying. But also, Sanusha, you noted how the G20 is a governance forum. You grounded us, brought us back to reality, and that is not a body that creates binding conventions. So you have to be very careful about what will be the momentum or traction of the Competent Africa post Africa's G20 presidency, especially with the United States of America that's not too keen on global governance and multilateralism. How will they be continued of the Competent Africa, especially in terms of the needs of African countries? Okay, thank you so much, Sanusha. Now I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, who's Professor Timuriti. Professor Timuriti is head of peacebuilding interventions at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. He's also an extraordinary professor of African Studies at the Center for African Studies at the University of Free State, South Africa. He has over 25 years of experience, or we can say a quarter of the fields of peace building, governance, international justice, and security in Africa, as well as relations. He has held posts at the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, United Kingdom, the Institute of Security Studies in Addis Ababa, and at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research in Geneva, Switzerland. He has also served as an advisor to the African Union and the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP. He serves as an honorary research associate for the Institute of Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa at the University of Cape Town. He has written over 100 journal articles, book chapters, and policy papers. Professor, how do you make time for such excellence? He's an author and editor of 11 books, including the Handbook of Africa's International Relations as an editor, and the African Union Autocracy, Diplomacy, and Peacebuilding in Africa, also as a co-editor. I'm also happy to say that he's also a mentor of mine, and I really appreciate the support he's given me over the years. Prof, I'd like to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you so much, Tawanda, for this very kind invitation to participate in this discussion, and also to colleagues at SALO for setting up this very important discussion on the G20 Compact with Africa. And I very much echo the call for rethinking the Compact with Africa, Compact with Africa 2.0. I think specifically because also the African Union has now joined the G20. And this creates an interesting dynamic with South Africa no longer being, if you will, the lead voice from Africa, the African Union playing a more significant role. Just a little bit of, I think, to maybe take one step back and note that the G20 was established and very much spearheaded by Washington in 2008 to take responsibility for maintaining the stability of the international financial architecture. And you can see in a range of different G20 communiques, a commitment in terms of raising, addressing the issue of trade barriers, and also barriers to investment in goods and services. So this was really its original, its origin, this story of origin, if you will. And what we are seeing now in Washington is, in fact, Washington is tearing up the so-called Washington Consensus, the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, by imposing these tariffs, on a whole range of countries. And in a sense, Washington is also tearing up the script of the geoeconomic order. And it has yet to be seen what will become of this. I think Sanusha described it as a Gramscian moment that we're in. And we see the rule makers of yesterday, in fact, becoming the rule breakers of today, and the founding principles of some of our multilateral institutions, including global financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, are being put into question. Old certainties are certainly dying. And I think, as has also been mentioned, the spirit of multilateral consensus is being challenged. And I think then it's also important to note that the G20 itself is a manifestation of club governance. 75%, it represents 75% of the world's population, but it leaves a 25% that is unaccounted for. And therefore it is not a permanent, it should not be considered as a permanent institutional architecture. G20 is very much has of late been appearing to resemble more of a glorified talking shop that produces copious amounts of policy papers and recommendations with little or no impact in terms of improving the governance of the planet, more specifically improving the lives of
100%.
on the African continent.
100%.
I think Sadusha mentioned this quite clearly in terms of whether it has begun to impact on the lives of people. And in the unfolding trade war, I think there is a case as to whether the so-called protagonists of the liberal international order, across Washington, Brussels, London, so on, all who are members of the G20, are in fact due to some kind of review, questioning, rethinking of where we're headed, and therefore it's why the rethinking also of the compact with Africa becomes crucial. I think it's extremely important for Africa not to become a spectator, a plebeian spectator in the ongoing geo-economic chaos that is being unfolded. And that in fact, African countries, the African Union, must take a much more prominent and stronger lead on the stage, on the global stage, to actually try to shape the future of the multilateral institutions going forward. And whereas the G20 might be an important stepping stone, I think it is only an intermediary structure that should be that also has failed to address issues like climate chaos, food insecurity, illicit financial flows, the refugee crisis, and the regulation of artificial intelligence, on this geopolitical stage. So we do need to be a little bit more critical. I think Laura's paper could have benefited from much more critical analysis of the ideology that dominates what is known as the liberal international order, which is now unraveling, and whether this ideology is in fact appropriate for Africa's socio-economic reconstruction. While globalization has generated a range of very important opportunities for trade, increased access to markets and technology, I think it was Joseph Stiglitz in his very important book, Globalization and Its Discontents. Joseph Stiglitz was the former chief economist of the World Bank, who noted that we do have to question the market fundamentalist ideology, which has been, perpetuated and driven by the IMF, World Bank, and the WTO, who set the rules of the game to a large extent, which anchors what we describe today as a global financial architecture. This ideology, I think, has served the interests of the more industrialized countries in the global north at the expense of Africa. And in that sense, it has not addressed the true needs of the African continent, as indeed Bongiwe and Sanusha have pointed out in their presentations. And Stiglitz argues that the liberal international order is framed by a very narrow mindset, shaped by a particular vision of the global economy, often to the detriment of societies and people and issues around social justice, the environment, climate change, which African countries, have an interest in, and therefore Africa has to be engaged in this agenda, and which makes this SALO platform very important, and some of the work that colleagues like Dr. Tawanda are doing extremely important. And it does, the IMF itself has conducted research, and it published an article called Neoliberalism Oversold. I recommend you read this. It's only 4 pages long, in 2016. Neoliberalism Oversold, in which it argues that there are aspects of the neoliberal agenda that have clearly not delivered, and instead of delivering growth, some neoliberal policies have in fact increased inequality and destabilized societies. That's a very significant statement coming from the IMF's own research department. And I think we should take that on board rather than simply just, accept the ideology as it's presented. And the fact that the IMF makes significant decisions, World Bank and WTO make decisions on behalf of millions, if not billions of people around the world, it does raise the issue of the urgency of democratizing international economic institutions, international institutions for global governance, such as the United Nations system, the United Nations Security Council, because clearly people who are affected by decisions should be able to influence the institutions that are making these decisions, on their behalf. And I think the big challenge for Africa, I think, as Tawanda began to highlight in his mini presentation, he transitioned from a moderator to becoming a panelist briefly, is the question around Africa's economic and monetary sovereignty. And I think we can argue that since independence, and obviously going way back into colonialism and apartheid and all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade, Africa has never been able to assert its economic and monetary sovereignty and independence and function as an autonomous actor to pursue certain outcomes it would like to see on the continent. And it is not evident that with the compact with Africa, which was designed by Germany in 2017, even though South Africa is chairing, perhaps as a token actor, whether the compact with Africa will actually achieve this, even though obviously it's self-selecting and so on. And so I think the case for Compact with Africa 2.0 is absolutely vital. Despite the AU joining the G20, we have not seen efforts to reconfigure the imbalance in economic relations between Africa and the global north. And by any measure of the issue, one of the primary issues on the African continent, which I think Tawanda touched on very effectively, is the issue of debt cancellation for Africa, which is necessary. Too many African countries are paying more in interest payments on debt when compared to the revenue, the amounts that they allocate to healthcare, education, housing, infrastructure development, socio-economic reconstruction of their societies. I can give you an example. Countries like Ghana, Kenya, Angola, and South Africa had debt levels that increased threefold, in the last 15 years or so. In Mozambique, the debt GDP ratio increased from 38% to 130% between 2011 and 2016, and in 2017, it defaulted on its debt. And today we have crisis across the country, and we're wondering why this is happening in terms of civil strife. And this is a general trend throughout the African continent. African countries are increasingly more indebted towards the rest of the world, and the majority of African countries are essentially carrying unsustainable debt, which in fact does not enable societies to grow. And that's why we need platforms such as this one to in fact make the argument and to mobilize social movements and activists to make the case that we need to actually pursue an African agenda that seeks much more socially just societies, an autonomous economic and monetary policy for the continent, anchored on the African Continental Free Trade Area, the strengthening of our own continental institutions as well, like the African Union, and increasing its prominent role within the institutions like the G20 and global multilateral institutions. Because where we are right now, as was mentioned before, and I think I'll begin to conclude by this, is that the rules are changing dramatically, and the new world is emerging. And the rule makers of yesterday, as I said, are the rule breakers of today. They're smashing the old systems, and Africa has to be in the arena, taking part in that conversation, and helping to influence particular outcomes. And in this regard, I think, because particularly the IMF and World Bank are essentially adjunct institutions of the United Nations system, we need to begin to think of how a root and branch comprehensive review of the United Nations Charter by invoking Article 109 of the United Nations Charter can actually enable us to address and dismantle the outdated power hierarchies, global power hierarchies, and improve and democratize the international financial architecture, and enable African countries to be actively involved in determining how they will achieve the outcomes that they would like to achieve in terms of strengthening their societies. So I think let me just perhaps stop there. We can pick up some of these conversations in the Q&A session. And South Africa's role in the G20 can put some of these agenda items on the table, notably invoking Article 109 of the UN Charter, which can in fact lead towards a root and branch transformation of the global governance institutions, but also the global financial architecture, notably IMF, World Bank, that are, as I mentioned, adjacent and linked to the United Nations system. So Tawanda, let me stop there, and happy to come in during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Tim, for that sobering and critical analysis. And you warned us that Africa must not become a spectator in global governance. And I think what you said really does complement what I referred to earlier, the recommendations by Rufus Dakote of the African Developmental Bank. He's an executive director, and he calls for a new development compact. And one thing he mentioned that you also highlighted was economic sovereignty. He used that term precisely. And he said it's imperative for Africa to be able to fund its own development or developmental agenda. And this begins with improved domestic revenue and resource mobilization. So the Compact of Africa, to be fair, does allude to the importance of improving the collection of domestic revenue, and it highlights reforms oriented towards tax, savings, and also we could also consider the issue of illicit financial outflows, although that's not exactly mentioned by the Compact of Africa. But it relates to the Compact of Africa because the Compact of Africa is saying that investment is subpar. Investment coming to Africa is subpar. But then at the same time, every single year, we lose, I think, an estimated $81 billion of illicit outflows of capital. But then in 2023, we recorded about 53 billion of foreign direct investment. So how does that work? We're bringing in 53 billion, but we're losing 81 billion due to illicit financial outflows, which undermines the whole purpose of the Compact of Africa, which is set to improve foreign direct investment. But also, Prof, you mentioned the unsustainable dependence on international aid and international credit. Africa is way too dependent on international donors, but also we're starting to have a worrying trend where our creditors are starting to be more private-based creditors. So Africa's credit profile is starting to be characterized by private entities, whether it's at the bilateral level or the commercial multilateral level. So that's got its own issues around transparency and debt repayments. And then, so fundamentally, you called for a need for radical thinking and a new inclusive global economic system. Yes, so very weighty issues, and hopefully we can have other insights from the participants in this dialogue. Thank you so much, Prof. Right, and now I'd like to head over to our final speaker, Dr. G. Raj Chinatram. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And thank you for being able to join us. I think you had a bit of an emergency in the morning. I hope that has been resolved. Dr. Chinatram is a program officer at the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council Secretariat, ECOSOC, of the African Union. Dr. Raj has over 20 years of experience in projects and NGO management. He founded the African Network for Policy Research and Advocacy for Sustainability in his home country of Mauritius, which has now established itself as a leading national and regional NGO platform advocating for the cause of sustainable development issues. Dr. Raj is one of the pioneers of the largest global civic movement, World Cleanup Day, and in 2017 he was appointed as country leader for Mauritius. And ever since, the movement has grown to the biggest national greening and cleanup Mauritius initiative. Dr. Chinatram has chaired the Infrastructure and Energy Cluster Committee of ECOSOC between February 2015 and December 2018. During this term, as a member of the General Assembly of ECOSOC, he significantly contributed towards, firstly, drafting ECOSOC's strategic plan, as well as the conceptualization of ECOSOC's communication strategy. Since October of 2020, Dr. Chinatram has been mandated as a desk officer at the ECOSOC Secretariat in Zambia. Welcome, Dr. Raj. Thank you for being able to finally join us.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and many apologies for not joining earlier. And I know it's a bit difficult for me now to just jump into this series of conversation because I've not been following since the start. But definitely, I'll try to go through my presentation, and maybe some of the slides I will just skip and go quickly on them, because I'm sure by now there's much more context about what we are talking about, the compact with Africa, about G20. So allow me to start my presentation. I know I've been able to share my screen. Let me just check
Sorry,
again.
can you try again? I pressed.
Okay. Okay, so I think my screen is visible from the other side.
Yes.
Mr. Moderator, Mr. Tawanda.
Yes.
So may I proceed?
Yes, it's very clear. Yes,
Great,
please. Go ahead.
great,
Thank you so
great.
much.
So I have a very brief presentation. It's just because of the mandate of ECOSOC, we are a civil society organ and advisory organ of the African Union. So basically, we just try to see how we, as the organ mandated by the AU, to streamline the participation of CSOs in the affairs of the Union, try to come into play with this new development, with Africa's first presidency of G20, but also about how we can influence also the C20 and also contribute to the event happening in November 2025. So basically, I'll just go through this and setting the scene. I don't think that is of much importance now, because I'm sure most of the previous speakers, they have covered what is the very essence of the CWA rather. So I'm sure you all know that it was launched in 2017 under the German co-chairmanship. And we have, as it stands now, 13 African countries, which are members of the Compact with Africa. And mostly we'll find countries in West Africa. You have the highest number of countries in Western Africa, which are members. The Southern African nations, except South Africa, none of them are members. But South Africa is also one of the co-chair, but not as a compact country member. So that is just as background, but I'm sure these have been covered in the previous presentations. So the roadmap for the compact with Africa. So from what we know is that we have two phases, the phase 1, 2017 to 2024, and then phase 2, 2025 to 2028. So basically phase 1 was, we noticed an increase in FDI, especially quite a significant increase, almost 36% in FDI in these countries, especially the compact. I mean, the countries I'm mentioning here, the compact with African countries, but also the figures that we have is like now we have over 40% of Africa's total FDI. It's due to the CWA efforts to attract those FDI. In phase 2 will be mostly about policy reforms, so how this will influence policy, but also the focus for phase 2 will be about expanding the membership, but also looking at reforms. I listened to the presentation of our very eminent Professor Tim Moruti, and the emphasis now is basically on reform. So that should be the prime focus for the phase 2. So African CSOs, and we need to know what's their views and how they see compact with Africa, but also the challenges and also what are the potential benefits of engaging with African CSOs. So basically, we all know that CSOs are pivotal to ensuring, even at the AU, we need the voice of the civil society. So in the compact with Africa, so we know that we'll have the CSOs will play a pivotal role that will help to align with equitable, sustainable development. So the CSOs are also very vital for us to ensure meaningful inclusion, because we no longer speak about just sustainable development, but we also speak about inclusive development. So to have inclusion of African CSOs for formal roles in the G20 Africa dialogues, but also ensure how they can safeguard. I mean, basically how we can ensure that this compact with Africa becomes a tool to ensure democratic and sustainable growth. What's the role basically of ECOSOC here? I'm sure most of you know about ECOSOC, an organ of the African Union. So our main objectives is to contribute to the integration and inclusive development of the continent, but also primarily to provide a platform through which the AU could partner and engage with CSOs on the continent. And this is where we are very keen to play an important role in the C20, how we can rally the CSOs, the think tanks on the continent, and to echo one voice, to amplify the voice of the African CSOs, leveraging on the network that we have, the extensive CSO network we have in the continent, but also on the formal institutional channels for us to convey to AU member states policy advisories, policy briefs, opinions about civil society on any subject matter. And here basically would be on the the Compact with Africa and the G20. So these are among our main objectives. So basically we act as a bridge between member states and the people. And we are here basically all African citizens. De facto, you are part and parcel of the African Union and part and parcel of ECOSOC. So if we look quickly at some of the quick achievements of African CSOs, how they have been contributing in the G20 process. So we've seen, and there's quite evidence, documented evidence about G20's, the CSO's role in the debt service suspension initiative during COVID-19. We have also seen quite a number of CSOs on the continent advocating for climate finance commitments. So, and we have seen significant presence of African CSOs doing that. Also, CSOs advocating for the AFCFTA, one of the flagship projects of the African Union, but also strengthening the AU's permanent membership in the G20. So now, since 2023, we are all, sorry, we all know that now the African Union finally has a permanent seat in the G20. So, but there's also quite some criticism about from the African CSOs. So, my apology. So, I mean, I've just tried to capture some of the main criticisms that you can hear from the civil society, the wider civil society, is about the agenda. Basically, the opinion is that it's mostly a Western imposed agenda that we are having when we are discussing this compact with Africa. And as if we are just trying to replicate the Western agenda. There's also quite some skepticism about economic assumptions. And there's an urgent call for structural reforms. So there are systemic issues like tax evasion and trade rules. Basically, we find most of the CSOs, they're advocating for this. But now what we've seen that there's a pressing need for us to push for the reforms. Sorry. We also need to have, I mean, the consensus is about the inclusivity, as much as the very idea to have the you know, to get CSOs on board is to ensure inclusion, but then there's quite some views echoing that there's limited inclusivity in the process. So, but basically, we'll find that in an ideal situation, the role of CSOs in the Compact with Africa can be categorized in four main chapters. Basically, we have the policy advocacy and reforms, accountability, inclusiveness, but also institutional engagement mechanism. So on the first component about policy advocacy, so CSOs can play an integral role in integrating the local priorities. So how they can embed the grassroots perspectives into the various country-specific reforms. Sorry. So here, if we go down again, you'll find that how the CSOs can help also to align with various continental frameworks, especially here, how we can link the Compact with Africa reforms with the AU's Agenda 2063, and also with other developmental, sorry, and also with the SDGs, but also other developmental plans, advocating for the green climate and green economy. So basically, we'll find that the advocacy space and the reform space, this is where CSOs have a significant role to play. In terms of accountability, also, we know that CSOs, mostly in member organizations, in member states, rather, we find most CSOs play a watchdog role. But I mean, ECOSOC, we don't play that as much as with an umbrella of all African CSOs, but we don't promote the idea for CSOs to act as a watchdog, but at least rather for CSOs to advise government on alternatives. What would be best in the scenario? What are options that we can give to member states? So basically, the role of CSOs here will be for monitoring and accountability. So tracking compliance, the reform compliance, exposing when there are fiscal risk. So use platforms like the C20, T20 to expose those risks, but also to evaluate the impacts of the investment. As much as we've seen that FDI has come on the continent, but whether these impacts have really met the needs of the population at large. So these are all where we need our think tanks, our CSOs to be on the grounds and to advise. So CSOs also have to play an important role in ensuring that there's a space for the marginalized, for the vulnerable groups. So inclusiveness is key. So we need to have inclusive dialogue. And we have seen in COVID-19 how CSOs also engage in crisis response and push the Compact with Africa to prioritize health infrastructure on the continent. And now there's more and more emphasis on the digital equity. So how, especially with AI, the advent of AI, how we can include, we can have AI be part and parcel of the discourse that we are having on the Compact with Africa. But primarily and most importantly, CSOs will play a key role in institutional, especially when we look at the framework for engagement, institutional engagement mechanism. So we have the C20 working groups, even the T20. So we need I mean, like the role of CSO is not only appreciated but much acclaimed, and we know that we need the CSOs to help to draft policy recommendations. But this is also where ECOSOC is keen to support and to play a role as requested or as recommended by CSOs on the continent, how we can play a role and to rally the voices of the African citizenry. Also, we'll find basically how CSOs can engage with the African Advisory Group and advocate for observer roles in the G20 Finance Ministers Evaluation Meeting on the progress of the Compact with Africa. So basically, that gives you the four chapters that we mentioned earlier about how CSOs can play a leading role in shaping the agenda for the Compact with Africa, especially this year as we, Africa, we preside over the G20 leadership. So some basic recommendations for stronger African CSOs engagement. So we'll need to have some sort of formalized CSO G20 engagement channels. ECOSOC is here. I know we have the C20, T20, but then we need also to see how we can open up that space and increase not only the space, but also have to formalize, as I mentioned. Increase funding for African policy research. So we know that the issue that we have on the continent is lack of funding for research. So if we need to have credible inputs, then basically we need to invest on R&D, basically on research. And strengthen our alliances with global CSOs, but also leverage on digital advocacy. So now we've seen with the advent of social media, and even now today, as we're doing these webinars, these town hall sessions, so how we are leveraging and doing using cost-effective means for us to do the advocacy, which in prior to the COVID times, that would have been something we could not have even fancied about. So basically, these are some key recommendations about how we can enhance the engagement of African CSOs. So talking about reforms, I just want to put this slide to inform all participants of the call that we have the 4th International Conference for Financing for Development taking place in Sevilla. That will be end of June, first week of July. And we are very glad to inform you that as ECOSOC, as the African Union, we are having one of the side events on the reforms, basically on that will be on the tax reforms, the financial revision of the financial architecture. So we have a side event taking place on the 1st July. And so you are all invited. So if you want more information, You can find the information on the website of ECOSOC, but I can also share with the organizers and they can trickle down the information to all the participants. So basically, that's just an invitation because this is also in line with the reform of the financial architecture that we have been mentioning. In terms of while concluding, we need also to see what is there now as during this presidency of Africa's presidency, the challenges and what is the new dynamics. So basically, we know we'll have some geopolitical hurdles. We know also that South Africa will need to advocate for the debt relief. And we also need to engage in high-level multilateral advocacy, especially pushing for the reforms of the UN Security Council. And I'm very glad, again, I'm just mentioning the name of Professor Tim Muroti because I know he has very been engaged in this dialogue for the UN Security Council reform. So I'm sure during his presentation, he has covered about what we are doing at the level of the African Union, especially ECOSOC, and other CSO platforms to push for the reforms of the UN Security Council. But this also, when we're talking about South Africa's presidency, there's also lots of opportunities for Africa's future. So we can, some of them are mobilization and investment, how we move for critical minerals and just transition, cultural diplomacy. I'm not going in details in the slides. I know time is running out, but also I'm having some cough, but at least you get an idea about this is the direct, the shift that we want. The shift that we want from the traditional way of doing business, as we mentioned, it's no, we should get rid of the so-called Western agendas, but also primarily focus on the African agenda. So in terms of what the success will look like for the much awaited, the much anticipated November 2025 G20 summit in Joburg. So is how we can scale the reforms via the support of the African Union. So we have the buy-in of the African Union and how we can scale the reforms through the AU, its policy organs and African members, African Union member states. We also need one of the success factors will be about the concrete institutional reforms, the quota adjustments at the IMF, the UN tax conversion progress, amongst others. So basically, we need an in-depth, as we say, we need an open heart surgery. So this is what we need during this presidency of South Africa at the G20. Also, as the first African G20 president, South Africa embodies the continent's demand for its long overdue space in global governance. So making 2025 summit a pivotal moment for Africa's economic sovereignty. So basically, if we manage to push the agenda for Africa's economic sovereignty, so that will be a milestone and that will be one of the key indicators of success of Africa's G20 presidency. I cannot talk about the G20 without mentioning the reparation agenda. So as you're all aware, this year, 2025, the AU has proclaimed 2025 as the year of reparations, the justice for Africans and people of African descent for reparations. So in this G20 leadership, what we also want is to Africa to use the G20 as a springboard to plot forward, not as petitioners, but as architects of a world where Africa sets the blueprint. As much as we are speaking about reparation, we also don't want us to be looking just at the past, but also use this platform to look for the future and to build the future that Africa deserves. So basically, these are my quick slides, and I deeply apologize first and foremost that I have to rush through my presentation given the circumstances I'm having to present, but I'm very happy at least I made it, and I hope I have been able to shed at least some contributions from ECOSOC to the audience. So with these few words, remarks, I'll just hand the floor back to you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for inviting ECOSOC, and also my other colleagues, panelists, my apologies, I've not been following your presentation, so I'm sure you have shed more light and more insight in your presentations. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chinataram, and thank you for that presentation. And you highlighted how the compact with Africa is being challenged, you know what I mean? And it's clear that reforms are needed. And you made it explicit that African civil society is not necessarily impressed with the Compact with Africa as it is, and therefore, as we think of a Compact with Africa 2.0, it might need some reconfiguration. You noted the skepticism of the economic assumptions that underpin the Compact with Africa. You called for, the need for structural reforms to accompany the Compact with Africa. And also, you noted that there's some skepticism that it also seems as though it's a Western imposed agenda. And I did note earlier that the Compact with Africa does seem to have structural adjustment elements, although it is a voluntary program. Anyway, I would like now to open the floor for questions, and so at the Zoom platform, and and pose their questions, comments, and we can have a discussion. Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Any comments?
Tawanda,
Yes, please go ahead,
can you
Sophia.
see my hand up?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, I can. Thank
Yeah,
you.
okay. Uh, I just wanted to start off by, obviously thanking all the speakers. I think there's been a lot of insight and useful takeaways from it. But I think I sit with a kind of concern around what do we actually do with the takeaways, finally and ultimately, okay? And as part of my introductory remarks, statements, I stopped at a slide on key takeaways because SALO did have a dialogue on the CWA in particular. And I think there were some useful contributions made in the policy brief that SALO produced. Some of it overlaps with what some of the speakers have mentioned today. Not all of it, but there are some. It's good to see Ambassador Mandisi in this dialogue. He was one of the speakers in the December 2024 dialogue. And I think he raised a lot of the concerns, but also solutions in some way. And I think we're getting to a point where we need to be looking at those solutions. For example, I would personally, on the last input, that for civil society to ask for observer status on the Africa Advisory Group is, in a sense, for me, not a viable solution. Because when you have observer status, you're observing. You can't participate, you can't influence, you can't change anything. Okay? At the same time, ECOSAC is saying that one of the roles of ECOSAC is to kind of monitor and look at the implementation of the CWA. I might, I don't know if this comes across as cynical, but for example, it is a great achievement, and we can and do celebrate the fact that the AU is now a formal member of the G20. But we've been talking about reform of institutional structures for years, and we've narrowed it down to representation, to having a body. Okay, we haven't gone beyond having bodies occupying seats. To what exactly are those institutional mechanisms? When was it developed? When was it last reviewed? is it still applicable in the current geopolitical situation we find ourselves in? Is it still applicable in the economic crisis that's been felt around the world, etc.? So I think I would like to see more engagements on those issues. If there is time, if there isn't any other speaker at this point, and if Lily or Busi are able to share my presentation, I can kind of quickly go through the last of my slides. That is kind of looking at what were the key takeaways and how do we move forward. And as I said, Ambassador Mandisi is here. He'll see some of what he said. Tawanda, you will see some of the contributions you've made. And the reason I'm asking if there is time and I'm able to do that is I just sit with the feeling of, I don't know if I should say frustration or what it is, but our Minister of International Relations is only going to be meeting the AU finance ministers, right, on the compact with Africa towards the end of July 2025. Okay. What is he going with? Laura touched on it, and he uses, and in one of my slides, I kind of quote an extract from a speech of his, where he basically says, sorry, I'm going to have to open my slide on my side so that I can tell you what it says. But I'd like to see a situation where our minister can go with more than just what he has said. Sorry, I'm opening here because I don't know if Lily and Busi are unable to share.
I was
I
just
don't think
waiting
I'm.
for Tawanda to say, because I do see other hands up, so I'm
Oh,
not
okay.
sure.
There's some
Okay.
hands, so it's I think I see one or two hands.
Sorry, I didn't hear Tawanda.
No, I'm saying, Safari, you can mention the last part, because I just want to give others a chance. I see two hands are up.
Yes, so I can
So you
if
can
I
just
go
speak to the last
to
point, and then
yeah,
we
I'm
can.
gonna speak to the last slide. Okay, just on the point I was saying. This is just an extract from a speech, right? And this is all that he said about the CWA, that there's going to be a G20 CWA meeting held in Addis in July 2025. And his other comment was that they will use the meeting to pursue a broadened and effective G20 CWA, including increasing the number of AU members that become participating African countries. So he's going there with an agenda of broadening the CWA and getting more members to sign the compacts. Again, for me, this particular statement, and goes back to what I call the sort of frustration, is what does that mean practically?
Okay.
On a very, very practical level, okay? I'm left here listening to the presentations where I'm even asking myself, should we be having a CWA 2.0? Okay. How does it interact with, and those are what my other slides are about. How does it interact with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? How does it interact around BRICS? How does it interact with the fact that a number of African countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, etc., have begun to cut those kind of Western colonial operations within their countries, okay? And a very, very hard, very, very difficult question for us, which I think none of us want to really, really confront at this point, is how do we begin to engage on the compact with Africa? Like I'm saying, I'm questioning whether we should even have it, okay?
Bro, I'd love to, if you could
But
just make the final
okay, I'm going to
points.
wrap up quickly. Okay? We just go to, and I think people have different views, right? Around the recent President Cyril Ramaphosa Trump Oval Office meeting, okay? And all that's happened around it. And I think that the bottom line, and when you read between the lines of people's comments, we kind of soft diplomacy went into that kind of meeting, but it is in some ways such a contradiction to pushing African agency, African needs, African whatever. You know, it brings us into questions around multilateralism or bilateralism. The Oval Office suggests a bilateralism position from South Africa. How is that going to affect all of this? So I'm going to leave it at there, at that, and I'm hoping speakers and other people would be
Okay.
able to respond. Thanks, Tawanda, and sorry for
Okay, I'll
taking
take
extra time.
No problem. Thank you so much, Safura. I'll take Luwazi and then we'll have Sanusha.
All right. Thank you so much, Tawanda, and thank you to the panelists on this very interesting discussion around the Compact with Africa. And a lot of the arguments presented before today, there is a realization that the Compact of Africa itself is outdated. It needs to align with later iterations around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, especially linking it with the general investments. But the fundamental question has been is that why has there been a general low uptake of the Compact with Africa? And whether or not this general low uptake with the Compact with Africa might be impacted by the bilateral approach that the Donald Trump administration will take going forward with the African continent that future presidents within the United States might take up. That also impacts on how Europe approaches Africa, the African continent, along with whether or not these various multilateral arrangements themselves still hold water in this general approach.
Luwazi, just repeat the last minute of you speaking. You cut off suddenly.
No, sorry,
All
John,
right.
that was you. We could hear him.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. sorry.
No
Okay.
worries. It's a network issue.
Right.
Sorry about that.
So part and parcel of this, right, is when we're analyzing a general review of the G20 itself, we should also review not just the Compact with Africa, but the systematic underpinnings of these various institutional platforms that are currently presented before us. Because on whether or not they're effective enough in delivering the democratic dividends or what was presented before, because there's the great highlight of the failure of the current neoliberal world order, and whether or not the current failures of the neoliberal world order present an opportunity for a different kind of engagement that we might see. So what does that now represent when we're reviewing multilateral institutions such as the G20, along with compacts around Africa, and now presenting this new dynamic of those who created the international rules-based system and multilateralism itself are now systematically dismantling it for a more bilateral relationship. So that will be very interesting for some of the panelists to just unpack for us further, for us to understand. Thank you, Tawanda, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this session.
Thank you so much, Luwazi. Sanusha, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you, Tawanda, and I want to thank Luwazi and Sephora and other panelists for kind of putting something out there, I think, which we can't essentially kind of mask or kind of just move around. I think it's a very core issue in terms of what does this all mean. But more importantly, there's a similar uncomfortableness I have about not just the G20, but I think the context of the G20 going forward, because a lot of the issues we are raising has to actually also take into account that we are in a very difficult world order. We don't know what's going to happen. And of course, we talk about the liberal economic crisis. We talk about the fact that the growth model is also in a crisis. We talk about the fact that we're not long away from Agenda 2060, Agenda 2030, not even 2063. And we are in a very difficult position because the architecture of Agenda 2030 is very much this idea that you leave no one behind, but we can see a lot of that disconnect with around the development, financing, and stuff like that. And I think to maybe come to some of the points that were raised about what are we doing with this compact? What are we doing with the G20? And one of the things I think we have to be very honest about is we're entering a very difficult but also an unknown international order. And I don't think it's only about the crisis of the liberal economic order. I think it's the crisis of an order that's going into a post-liberal world. And I think that in itself is the crisis that we need to think about, because we're trying to understand what is the economic architecture and the structural conditions that we need to think about, whether it's economic sovereignty, whether it's reforms of the UN Security Council, the whole global architecture, the governance architecture of that reform. But something is coming to an end here. And that's what frightens us. And so the question would be, we cannot afford to look at the G20 with the same lens that we've always looked at the G20. Because the G20 is not just about Africa. The G20 is about what we call or define the 20 richest countries in the world, which changes. It changes constantly. It's based on the metric that we're using. The metric is the crisis. It's the failure of the growth model. It's the failure of the fact that intrinsically linked into the model that we've been using has created contradictions. And so I think that for part of what Loazi is raising is, what are we anticipating? And I think that's the big question in the room. What are we anticipating? Are we able to anticipate? And more importantly, I think just thinking about, Tawanda, you and I were at a Nelson Mandela thing last week about reimagining trade. What are we reimagining it for, and who are we reimagining it to? In other words, this constant juxtaposition about the fact that we're still trying to keep the model intact, but the model is actually unraveling at the rate of knots. So that, I think, is the critical question for the CWA, whether we keep it, whether we don't keep it, whether it serves a utility or not. But I think part of the challenge is we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's the challenge for us. So there are elements of something that we need to keep, but what are those elements that we want to keep? And I think the big challenge for us in Africa is to understand that the G20 is not just about Africa. You have C20, which is made up of global civil society actors. You have think tanks, which are made up of a number of different actors that come both from South Africa, from Africa, and outside of South Africa. Then, of course, you have the G7 in the G20. You have the BRICS in the G20. And all of them come with all of their interests that are now kind of coalescing and also kind of contradicting each other. The big question we should have is this meeting that happened on the sidelines of the IMF and the World Bank in April. There is a sense that one gets from the finance track, which is linked to the CWA, is they want to streamline the agenda of the G20, that the agenda has become too overwhelming, that the agenda has become bulky, and that you need to have it much more focused. And that seems to be another question around this issue of CWA. Where does it fit? It's in the finance track because it's kind of linked to financing and investment, whatever. But there's also a question around how central bank governors, and in particular, I think what was raised in the last presentation around ECOSOC and whatever, is this financing for development and financing of the commons and so forth. What are we doing with this stuff? What do we want to achieve? And I think if we have a very simple outcome for the CWA, very simple, one that doesn't necessarily anchor us only in the G20, but to look beyond the G20, because you're going to have competing interests. And we do know that there has been some tensions around the Civil 20, because the Civil 20 hasn't really got its traction out of the ground. And there's been tensions around civil society actors and all of that. And I think that's going to be another complication and complexity. The other point to make is, what are the gaps does the CWA want to address in Africa? Because it's the compact for Africa. It's not the compact for the world. We had Tony Blair's Commission for Africa. We had all of these different things under the G7. What is it that you want to address in Africa? And what are the steps that are doable? I think the bigger political issues around the reform of the agenda and the questions around the structural issues, etc., let that happen in terms of what happens at the high level table in the G20. But I think the question would be is, what are the gaps that you want to address? And you raised this, Tawanda, throughout the discussion in this platform. And you raised it about thinking about infrastructure deficits, economic infrastructure deficits, social infrastructure deficits. You raised trade financing deficits. You spoke about debt servicing gaps, and you spoke about illicit financial flows. Now, if Africa is to have an investment that's linked to how you actually build up your mobilization of domestic resources, I think you need to think about what your gaps are and where you need to start thinking about this. Because one of the key things that is a political issue in the G20 around the debt servicing issue, and this year alone, according to former Minister Manuel, Africa is going to spend at least around about $89 billion in external debt servicing alone. For me, that is a key question, because that question then says that how do you deal with that, but also illicit financial flows? Are our partners in the G20, through the C20, through the other avenues as well, are willing to address those issues? If they are willing to address that and plug that gap, then we start with the steps around what a C20, what a CWA 2.0 is. But if you're not willing to address that elephant in the room, then of course we need to think about how Africa takes that forward. And that's the issue. So you've got the question around the cost of capital, the servicing of debt, and how expensive it is that Africa has to raise debt in international markets. But that's a bigger question around the global financial architecture and stuff like that. But I think there are some simple things that we need to make firm, key, concrete decisions that the African Union needs to take forward. But I'm also mindful of the fact that we have very disparate issues, a very disparate regional economic communities in Africa that are not talking to each other, both at the intrastate level and at the regional level. And then you put into the mix conflict, and it all becomes about not just bilateralism with external partners, because I don't think Trump is the reason for it. It's been happening for the longest time, if you look at the WTO reform questions. But I think it's because at the end of the day, there's a bilateralism in Africa that we all have to protect ourselves first, and then all else will follow. So I think if we can set that agenda in terms of what are some of the doable things that you need to take as concrete steps, then it's important. But it needs for African countries and so forth to come together and say, we're going to work as a unit and not independently of each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanusha. Any more hands? Okay, I just want to pose two queries, if I may be allowed. The first is to Laura, and it's noted that Africa has got 1.42 trillion of stock market capitalization. So if you combine all the stock market exchanges on the African continent, they have a market cap of 1.4 trillion US dollars. Of course, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the most significant contributor to that 1.4 trillion. Secondly, if we combine the market capitalization of all the biggest companies on the African continent, this is the formal enterprises, they have a market capitalization of 564 billion. Right. So, Laura, where is all this pool of money? Can it be pulled towards the developmental agenda? Can it be pulled towards addressing unemployment? Is it an asset for how the compact with Africa should work? And it also could then tie into the question of economic sovereignty that Professor Moriti raised, that maybe if we're going to depend more on our private enterprises to boost our growth, there could be less dependence on external credit, especially from private creditors. So I just wanted to ask you, Laura, where is the private sector in this conversation? And that's the formal private sector, but also where is the small and medium enterprise sector, which is the largest employer on the African continent within the informal sector? And then lastly, this question is to Dr. Raj and to Dr. Bongiwe. Is it possible for us as the continent to, now that South Africa and also the AU are big forces in the G20, is it possible to advocate for a debt moratorium or debt suspension to allow for the fulfillment of development objectives? So in other words, as Sanusha noted, this year alone, we have to pay about 80 something billion worth of debt repayments. In total, Africa's external debt stands at 685 billion. So is there a way to kind of suspend that debt, to put some kind of debt moratorium so that we can adequately invest in our human capital? Because ultimately, there's no private sector without people, and people are human capital, human resources, and we're spending a bit low in terms of healthcare and other social services compared to our regional peers. So is there a way that we can advocate for a debt suspension or debt moratorium within the G20 framework to complement what the Compact with Africa is trying to achieve? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I start responding to your question? Thank you, and thank you for the question. I'm going to keep my response quite short because I think it links very directly to the rest of the conversation that a lot of the panelists have raised and also those who've raised now in this discussion. As you mentioned, like the informal sector on the continent, it's at about 80%. And just to put that into relative terms, Europe sits at about 25%, and the Americas, North and South, I think, sit at about 40%. So we really do have an issue in terms of the formal private sector. But at the same time, the private sector on the continent has accounted for 80% of production and about 2/3 of total investment on the continent. So even with the small amount of formal sector or formalization, its impact is quite significant in contributing to our country's growth. So I think that this is where the potential is. And now I want to link this in directly to what Sanusha raised towards the end of her last intervention about looking at what is the Compact with Africa trying to achieve. And I think very simply, it's trying to increase investment in African countries. That is the mandate of it. And I think we can't see it as a panacea for all African issues. It's one tool in the toolbox, but we need to make sure that that tool is working for its specific mandate. So I want to reiterate something that I raised during my initial presentation, is that we need to fill in the links between increasing investment of private sector, whether it's intra-African investment or from private sector away from or out of the continent. So linking the increase of investment in economic growth and our development objectives. So that's where we need to make sure that the impact is on the ground, that the people actually see that impact. And again, linking it to what is happening externally. So this is being one tool in the toolbox in how we can, when we see an international environment of increasing protectionism, there's increasing securitization of funding. So international aid is not going necessarily towards development, but has the security focus of it. African countries need alternatives to the traditional aid model. This is one tool. And the other tools some of the colleagues have mentioned is improving domestic resource mobilization. This can be through formalizing the private sector. And just to touch on a webinar series last week or 2 weeks ago that a set held as part of the Compact with Africa. It was a lessons learning discussion with Compact with Africa countries on the issue of domestic resource mobilization. So we can see this is also a way that the Compact, other than just the country level reforms, but lessons learning. And this doesn't have to be done under the Compact with Africa mandate. It can be happening across the continent more informally, but I think that the Compact provides the platform and gives the push for these types of engagements to happen. And maybe we need to push for more of these engagements, and also bringing in other actors like the private sector, but also civil society. Like the ECOSOC colleague mentioned, they want a bigger voice in these discussions. So even if it's not a formal seat at the table at the AAG meetings, but it's being involved in these lessons learning discussions. Including, or in addition to improving DRM, we also have to plug the financial leakage gap. As you mentioned, the previous stat was about 80 something billion that the continent loses. I think this is up to about 90 billion in the recent African Economic Outlook 2025 that we're losing in illicit financial flows. We need to be able to plug this so that any income that we receive or direct investment is actually going to the development objectives. And then lastly, as Sanusha, as Prof. Mariti has said, it's the issue of dealing with the cost of capital. Trevor Manuel has said that several times, the issue is not that we can't attain credit, it's that it's unsustainable. It's that compared to other countries, their debt to GDP ratio might be higher, but they're able to pay and to keep it at a sustainable level. So these are the discussions that happen beyond the Compact with Africa. They also happen beyond just the G20 level. So we need to look at these discussions in the broader scheme, but also make sure that when we're talking about reforming the Compact with Africa, we're not trying to have it as a panacea for all issues. It's one tool in the toolbox.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that insightful comments, those insightful comments. Okay. Dr. Raj, has he gone?
Dr. Raj had said that he sent his apologies. He had to take his baby to the clinic, so wasn't able to stay on.
Okay. Dr. Bongiwe, any comments?
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit on your question. So your question around South Africa advocating for debt suspension at the G20. Yes, South Africa can do this. If you remember previously, South Africa has done it during COVID, which the argument was that to allow African countries to use the finances to respond to COVID. Even now, South Africa can still advocate for this under the international financial architecture reform agenda. It can push for debt suspension for Africa, and it's can do this. It can push for a G20 debt suspension and advocate to revive and improve the debt service suspension initiative. And then this can also be linked to climate debt relief mechanism, where South Africa can advocate for support of African-led initiative on climate change, and also on sustainable development. And then also South Africa can use the opportunity to advocate for debt relief, use the opportunity of the upcoming Finance for Development conference in Spain that is taking place in June. Build consensus and form strong coalitions with partners like the G7, the G77, and other global South blocs like BRICS, to build consensus on this issue and gain support. although someone mentioned earlier that, there is nothing legally binding, but it's important for South Africa to advocate for this so that at least it does somehow, some elements of this make it to the leaders' declaration. And then it will be easy to support that going forward. I think that South Africa being, the member of the G20 together with the AU, the advocacy doesn't have to stop this year. They can continue, supporting this point, within the G20 structures, working with other like-minded partners like Brazil, which also support this, and also India, and other European countries that have an appetite for this. So it's possible for South Africa to push this under the reform, the IFA reform agenda.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bongio. Thank you so much. Prof. Tim Muriti, do you have any thoughts on economic sovereignty?
Thank you so much, Tawanda. No, it's been wonderful. I've been listening into some of the really important interventions that have been made by colleagues. And just to say that I think it is clear we're in a zone where we can push significantly for a rethinking. You saw that South Africa's theme for the G20, solidarity, equality, sustainability, is crucial for the African continent. Partly why it was rebuffed also by Washington's, more inward-looking mercantilist agenda. So I think very much this is an important platform where we can air these issues out, and hopefully we can find ways to also bring these findings into the heart of the African Union through analysis. So I think it's been very fruitful, but also, looking forward to continue learning on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Right. Any final comments from anyone? From our speakers?
Tawanda.
Ambassador.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I just unmuted because for some reason, for the second time, I can't find the function for raising my hand. I don't know what has happened. Yeah, I hope you can hear me clearly.
Loud and clear, Ambassador. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers who I think have all raised important issues. And I think that one cannot disagree with the things that need to be done in order to achieve the objectives of the Compact with Africa, and perhaps work towards, CWA 2.0 in some ways, because we are, part of the international community, and all of these initiatives and platforms and institutional mechanisms that we have to engage with. So in that context, all of the issues that have been raised that would take us towards how do we improve on, CWA as it has existed, how do we move towards CWA 2.0. So I have no issues with all of those issues. But I couldn't help, as I was listening to the different speakers, I couldn't help finding myself thinking that, there is something else that we need, which is something that is very Africa focused, and fundamentally how it is, how we get Africa to focus on, collectively to focus on its own interest, its own agenda, and the things that it wants to achieve. Now, I'm going to try and explain what I mean by this. We've seen in post-COVID world, well, perhaps during COVID and post-COVID, and we've also seen in the post-Russia-Ukraine, war, as well as, the Trumpian dynamic that has begun to impact on a body such as NATO, for example. And what we've seen from all of these things that I've cited is how, I'll say, the Western world, is able to find resources for things that matter to them. So for COVID, suddenly, they were able to mobilize lots of resources. And they were able to even hoard things like vaccines, because that was something that was in their own interest. And when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, they found the resources, to render the support to Ukraine for their military effort. And now with Trump introducing, greater demands on NATO partners to spend more, on NATO, countries are finding the resources, to spend more, to increase their military budgets. And in some ways, I think that this is what we find ourselves unable to do as Africa Incorporated. In many ways, these issues that I've raised, they bring into sharp relief the points that have been made about the need for us to pay greater attention to issues of African domestic resource mobilization, and tapping into our own opportunities. I don't know, Bongiwe, if you remember when Professor Tayun Falola, gave the Africa lecture, I think it was in 2023. And he actually posed a very interesting question that has stuck with me, for the longest time. Whether we as Africans have really understood, the socio-economic initiatives, measures that Africans have developed for themselves, for their own survival. Now, I'm just talking about ordinary, Africans, and how do we tap into those in order to, design the right policies and frameworks and mechanisms, to propel those initiatives that Africans have developed for themselves, for their own survival. So I think that this is one thing. I mean, our institutions, whether it's our regional bodies or the African Union itself, I think a lot of the effort and the work that gets done there, it's to engage with the world, is to engage with all of these different bodies and all of these different blocs and countries that want to engage with Africa because of what Africa possesses. And so a lot of the time and effort of these institutions gets taken up by these engagements. So what was coming to my mind was that we probably do need, something alongside, our existing institutions whose time and effort and energies get taken up by these engagements to help us, to take, the frameworks that we have developed for ourselves and say, how do we respond to the issues that Sanusha was raising, for example, and some of the issues that have been raised about, how do we get our own initiatives in order to advance, our own agendas that we've developed for ourselves. So these are just, some of the issues that came to my mind. And coming back to the issue of CWA, which is a focus of today's discussion. Sure, a right question is being asked as to whether, there is a sufficient buy-in from African countries themselves, and the issues being raised about, working towards getting more countries to buy into this and sign up into this. But there is a question that we also need to ask. Is there sufficient buy-in from the other members of the G20 who are not African into this CWA? I think that's also a question that needs to be asked. And I think that lastly, an issue that we need to also worry about is what a US presidency of the G20 may mean. What is it that, if we've been observing what the US has been doing, to existing institutions, whether it's NATO or the WTO or all of the existing multilateral institutions, we must also begin to worry about what the US may do and what this may mean for the G20 going forward. So these are just some of the issues that came into my mind. I think the biggest difficulty for Africa in the context of all of these issues that we are discussing is that we do not have the option of disentanglement. So we still have to engage with existing institutions towards such issues as dealing with the debt burden that Africa, and African countries face, and to see whether we can, achieve something there that gives a bit of reprieve, so to speak, for African countries. So I thought I would just raise those issues, Tawanda.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're still waiting for that book, Ambassador. We're still waiting.
I knew you were going to say that.
Otherwise, thank you for making time to join us. It's truly appreciated. For those who don't know, Ambassador Madisi was a former G20 Sherpa for South Africa. He was also South Africa's former ambassador to Russia, but also to most recently to Rwanda, and of course he was the former minister, deputy minister of finance, and then I think minister of industry and trade, right, a few years ago. Right. Thank you so much. I think the time is gone, and I think I will have to wind up the discussion. So I'd just like to thank all the speakers, all the participants. Thank you so much. I'm not going to dare to give concluding remarks because so much has been said. But I will just say that one thing that's important to remember is that the private sector is people doing business, but it's still people. And the compact with Africa can't operate in isolation of initiatives that improve on the well-being of those people in terms of human capital development. So we have to consider the people we talk about when we talk about the private sector, not just the big corporations, but the small and medium enterprises that are the engine of African economic sustenance and growth. We have to consider 4 things. Are these people healthy? Are they educated? Are they digitally connected? And are they able to easily move throughout the region due to improved transport and also to less bureaucracy? So so the Competent Africa can't speak without including the human capital element of what's happening to the African populace, who are the economic actors on the continent. Right, and then that's the last thing from me. So I would like to end my things with this quote from Mr. Rufus Dakote, the African Development Bank executive, who has called for a new development compact. And he says this in quote, "Let this century be remembered not for aid dependency, but for domestic capital mobilization, small and medium enterprise driven innovation, and sovereign economic and infrastructure development." Okay, so thank you very much. From me, that's me concluding. I think Lily, you might want
Thank
to
you.
say a vote of thanks. Thank you so much, Lily.
Thank you. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Southern African Liaison Office, we'd like to thank everybody who has attended today, especially everyone who's engaged in the discussion. We've seen a lot of interesting comments in the chat, as well as people sharing their thoughts. Thank you so much to my colleague, Dr. Tawanda Sachikonye, for excellent facilitation today. Thank you so much to our panelists, Laura Rubridge, Dr. Bongiwe Ngobomphahlele, Dr. Raj Chintaram, Sanusha Naidu, and Prof. Tim Muriti. We're really, really grateful for all of your insight, and I think you've all given us quite a lot to think about, and we're looking forward to holding further SALO G20 dialogues where we can continue this very important discussion. Thank you to everybody and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanusha. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.